Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Tin Man's Corner channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey the Tin Man Taylor, and today I haven't done a ghost book reading video in a while, so I thought I'd get back started on that. So today we're reading a chapter out of the South Carolina Ghost from the Coast to the Mountains by Nancy Roberts, and this chapter is called The Crazy Quilt. So here we go. Clouds mounted along the horizon, while the sky turned an ominous, threatening yellow. All afternoon the young couple had waited for the quilt to be auctioned off. It had no plain design, and most women called it a crazy quilt. Annette Larson had chosen it as a Christmas gift. Hey, if I get a blanket or something at Christmas time, hey, I'll be fine. It keeps me warm at night. But anyway, from her fiance, marble top tables, massive oak beds, china, the once loved familiar objects of a Midwest farm family, went one by one to strangers. It seemed to Annette that the auctioneer would never pick up the quilt. She and John knew this was tornado weather and they ought to be heading home. A tornado in Great Plains country meant devastation for everything in its path, and sometimes death also. A patter of rain fell. Still they stayed on. John Gerber was a tall, shy young man with a kind way about him, and he really wanted Annette to have her heart's desire. Finally, the auctioneer held up the beautiful coverlet. He started it off at $10. John bid 15. 20 came a voice from the crowd. 25, called out John. 30, signaled another bidder. Boy, you like to be in that auction just to see everybody going like 5, 10, 15, whatever. But anyway, will anyone give me 35 for this fine quilt? Sure to bring happiness to the marriage bed. The auctioneer smiled and waited. John raised a finger, and the quilt was his. It is very beautiful, said the young Amish man admiringly before he handed it to Annette. The quilt was a multitude of brilliant colors. Now, it would be hers forever. Gusts of wind began to whip her skirt about her legs, and even before they reached the buggy, rain poured. Annette's hair clung in long, wet tendrils around her face. Gerber whipped the horses, and off they galloped at a mad pace through the deluge. The girl grew ever more pale as the wind rocked the buggy relentlessly. I hate to be in that, it'd be almost seasickening feeling, but anyway. The sound of the wind increased until it became a roar, and suddenly there was a horrendous jolt. John Gerber felt his wagon lift off the ground and sail through the air. Seconds stretched into an eternity, then he lost consciousness. When he recovered, he was lying on the ground, and all was deathly still. Amazed that he seemed unhurt, he picked himself up and looked for Annette. At first, all he saw were bits and pieces of the wagon and a tiny shred of her shawl. Why had they not left earlier? Then, perhaps 100 feet away, he saw the brightly colored quilt. He walked over to where it lay upon the ground, stretched out almost as neatly as it had been placed upon the bed. Dazed as he was, he could not help but notice its beauty. Then he realized something was beneath it. With a sense of terrible dread, he lifted a corner and exposed a lovely still face. Tenderly he turned down the bright coverlet and knelt beside his fiancée. One small, bruised hand clung tightly to the edge of the quilt. He called her name, finally shook her in an almost fierce gesture of rebellion, then cradled her body against him, only to have her head fall limply back. The girl so soon to have been his bride was dead. It was 1955 when Dora Monroe and her husband of Kershaw, South Carolina, moved to the handsome old house on Matson Street. A Midwestern family had once lived there briefly, then moved. Others had come and gone. Dora Monroe was one of those admirable women who pride themselves on meticulous housekeeping. And then the first thing she did was to give the place a thorough cleaning. When the rooms were painted and the floors refinished and polished to her satisfaction, she decided on the first cool day to straighten the attic. She had left one end of it untouched at the time of the move. Here's a picture of the quilt. I don't know if you can see it. It's in black and white, but in the title right in here, the caption underneath the picture says, "How could there be anything threatening about a quilt?" I know, you tell me. Anyway, what a sight it was. There were nuts cached by squirrels, rat droppings, cobwebs hanging from the rafters, and crumbling old newspaper along with remains of broken toys. She was almost through when way back in the dark corner, almost hidden under the eaves, she spied something. It was a large cardboard box, and filled with curiosity she tugged it out. A cloud of dust rose as she lifted the lid. Removing a layer of tissue paper, Dora Monroe was amazed to find one of the most beautiful handmade quilts she had ever seen. It was well over 100 years old, a kaleidoscope of colors, and in almost perfect condition. She immediately visualized it upon her guest room bed. A few months later, before her daughter Florence della Fossa arrived for the summer, she thought of the quilt and spread it over her bed. Her neighbors Nancy McHugh and Anne Fraser looked at it with mingled admiration and envy. Florence arrived to visit her mother the first day of May. After hugging her mother, chatting for a while, and packing only her most needed toilet articles, she retired. It was after midnight when she awoke, certain that her mother must be pulling the covers up around her shoulders, as she had done when Florence was a child. But when she called out "Mother" in the darkness, there was no answer, and she supposed that her mother had left. Dozing off, Florence was again awakening, this time by tugging motions on the quilt, and reaching down, she attempted to pull it back over her. She was frightened, but stubbornly continued to clutch the coverlet, and soon it became a tug of war in the pitch-black bedroom. There was a stronger than usual jerk, and she heard the hollow, spectral voice of a woman close to her bed. "Give me back my quilt. It's my Christmas gift," said the voice. "Give it back now or you'll be sorry." If the ghost said give it back to her, you better give it back to her right now. I don't know what the consequences would be. But anyway. Suddenly, she fell back in bed. The tug at the other end had ceased abruptly. Convinced that she had experienced a most extraordinary nightmare owing to fatigue from her trip, she fell into a restless slumber. The following morning, the incident seemed too bizarre to relate to her mother. A few nights later, as she lay awake, unable to sleep, she thought she felt the quilt move. At first, it was imperceptible. Suddenly, there was a convulsion, wrinkling, and it slithered up around her shoulders and neck. Before she could move, the quilt was a whip-like movement, threw itself over her face. Panic-stricken, Florence leaped from her bed. She turned on the hurricane lamp on the bedside table and settled herself in a chair in the corner of the room. The quilt lay on the bed in a pile where she had thrown it. She soon felt ridiculous. How could there be anything threatening about a blanket? She gradually became drowsy and was almost asleep. When the hall clock struck 2, rousing herself, she was ready to return to bed when, ever so gently, the triangles and squares began to ripple and undulate. As she stared in amazement, the quilt crept toward the head of the bed, straightening itself out and covered it as smoothly as if it had never been occupied. At that moment, she heard a soft knock on her bedroom door. She opened it with the grateful thought that it was her mother. Instead, Florence saw the the tall figure of a man. He wore a straw farmer's hat, and as he reached for her, a dank, putrid odor became almost overpowering. From the outstretched arms, her terrified gaze traveled upward to the man's face, and when she looked under the broad brim of the hat, she nearly fainted. The figure standing before her had a face so bruised and discolored that it scarcely appeared human. Somehow she was able to slam the door and lock it, expecting to hear pounding on the other side at any moment. Her heart thudded wildly as the room grew dark around her. When morning arrived, Florence found herself lying across the bed with the quilt neatly folded beside the door. She never slept under it again. Her fear of the quilt's being even in the same house with her became a phobia, and after relating the strange events to her mother, she was somewhat relieved. Nevertheless, they both knew they would feel easier when the quilt was out of the house. If you have an all-living experience and it's all related to one object like that quilt, yes, take it out of the house. And I do hear stories where they said ghosts are attached to objects like that. But anyway, what to do with it became something of a problem. Mrs. Moreau preferred to tell herself that her daughter had arrived in an overwrought state and that the more bizarre events in her story were simply imagined. On the other hand, she was too knowledgeable a woman to give the quilt to a friend in a town as small as Kershaw for it, and at this point she would not allow herself to think further. Several times she considered burning the quilt, but when she almost went to the linen closet to take it out, the bright colors almost seemed to glow in the dim light. She was not able to destroy it. One afternoon, a young Midwesterner named Alfred Hansen stopped by for a few hours on his way to the South Carolina coast. The conversation turned to antiques, and on an impulse, Mrs. Monroe brought out the quilt for him to see. He admired it profusely. She was aware of Florence's agitation. Her face became flushed, her breath quickened, and she left the room. Her mother determined the quilt must go. Hanson was overwhelmed by it, but Mrs. Monroe recalled his helping Florence out of the water when she had ventured too far the summer before. She urged him to accept the quilt. From the start, he had been tempted to give in, for he was greatly taken with it, and had only protested out of courtesy and surprise. By the time he was ready to leave, Mrs. Monroe had prevailed. Several months later, a letter arrived from her. Her face grew pale as she read it. She handed it to Florence. All right. The letter's down here typed in the bottom of the book. So it says, December 24th, 1954. Dear Mrs. Monroe, since I visited your home, some most unusual events have occurred. In fact, had I not recently been checked by a physician, I would be even more concerned over my present health. The doctor, a new friend of mine, impresses one at first as a tall, gaunt, almost rough sort of fellow, but he has been very kind and reassuring. Under normal circumstances, I would most certainly begin this letter by thanking you for your generous gift of the quilt I so admired. At the moment, it was difficult for me to do so. Indeed, you may be surprised to learn I have even considered some means of destroying your gift. Now, please do not take offense, for I do not mean that in any ungrateful way. I have slept with the quilt over my bed almost every night that I am able, although sometimes when I awaken in the morning I am weak with fatigue and drenched with perspiration. I am convinced that I'm often wrestled with it all night long. Does that astound you? A quilt that moves? Yes, that is what I believe I've seen. I am wondering if it does not have an existence of its own. This probably sounds foolish to you, of course. I had to describe my quilt to Dr. Gerber and showed it to him. When he saw it, he could say with an admiring yaw, "It is very beautiful." The poor man was so enamored of it that I even considered giving it to him, but for some reason, victory over this quilt has become something of an obsession with me. And I swear, although it may sound absurd, that I shall come up on top. A little pun, ugh. Well, perhaps you will hear with my wanderings I am not feeling well tonight, and I have just called Dr. Gerber, who will be here soon. Actually, I humored the good man, telling him that if anything happened to me, my housekeeper has been told that he is to have the quilt. He laughed, saying that my illness was certainly not fatal. Please forgive the smudge on the paper as I wrote. The light in my room went out. Now, I have gotten it back out on. And where is the quilt at the moment? It's on my bed, of course, and I have it just over my knees. Now, this should prove to you that it can move. It is now almost up to my neck. My God! And there, the letter to Mrs. Monroe ended, and closed with a brief note. I am forwarding Hanson's letter to you, written just before his attack. Undoubtedly, his hallucinations resulted in this unconscious state in which I found him. At my recommendation, he has left for a rest and chance of seeing, and he insisted on giving me his quilt, which, pathetically enough, the poor fellow believes to have been a factor in his illness. Respectfully, John Gerber. All right, here's the last page. So, the letters of the signature were tall and flowing. Dora Monroe sat down and wrote to Alfred Hanson. 3 months passed, and there were still no replies. She decided to phone and discovered Hanson's telephone had been disconnected. On impulse, she asked the operator for the number of Dr. John Gerber. We have a Hans Gerber and a Eugene Gerber. Could it be one of those? No. Well, madam, I'm checking. I don't find that we've ever had a listing for a Dr. John Gerber. Okay, that sounds ridiculous. If a man says Dr. John Gerber, that's his name, and then all of a sudden you can't find a listing for him. But anyway, that's going to be it for now, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more book reading content like this. And this has been another successful installment of the Tin Man's Corner channel. I'm your host, Jeffrey the Tin Man Taylor, and I'll see you next time. So long, everybody.